Good morning, everyone. I promise this to be relatively quick before your break. I won't keep you too long. So, autism. We actually are learning a lot about autistic folk. I myself am one, and so is everyone else I know. We're learning a lot because we're putting people in brain scanners. We're actually researching what is behind the behaviors, and our understanding of autism is changing pretty quickly. So the question is how does that affect housing? Like, why am I here today? That's pretty simple, really. There we go. Firstly, what is autism? It is neurodiversity. It's a different brain design from before birth. It is not a behavior. That was one of the earliest understandings of autism. We've moved past that to a certain extent now. It's not a mental health condition. It's not a learning disability. The key one here is actually that it suffers from sensory overload. I'll explain more about this in a second. But it's important to understand an autistic brain is not broken in some way. An autistic brain is not malfunctioning or anything like that. It's a different brain design, very specifically. And as I'm a very visual person, I love thinking of the brain as a series of roads. I love thinking of it as a series of roads, and information is traffic. It's cars coming into the brain. If you look at the brain scan at the top of the picture here, the brain on the right has a very defined road. That is a road that is designed for a specific thing. In this case, the two people have been asked to talk about a picture. They've been asked to talk about a social situation. And the brain on the right has a motorway. It has a large connection to deal with that influx of information coming about, talking about that social interaction. The brain on the left has no major connection. So what it's doing is traffic's coming in and it's finding itself on a tiny little country road, and it is spreading out across the brain. And what we find with autistic folk is that our brains are far more likely to have this spread of information, because what our brains are is we have motorways and we have tiny country roads. And if you're not using our motorways, the brain becomes overloaded very, very easily indeed. Apologies if I'm messing up my words a bit. Someone's just started mowing a lawn outside, which is really peculiar during this time of year. So hopefully that's going to stop pretty quickly. If you imagine that the sensory portion of the brain is a roundabout, you've got a road coming onto the roundabout from every single one of your senses. So from noise, so for example, a lovely lawnmower coming onto the brain. For example, from visual, for everything, all of the senses are coming on. The autistic brain, unfortunately, still has the idea of motorways and little country roads. It means we absorb a lot of information sometimes onto roads that simply can't handle it. For example, you can't see me at the moment because I'm in a pitch black room wearing noise cancelling headphones underneath a blanket in a specialist chair I've had to order, in specialist clothes I've had to order. The reason for that is I'm trying to monitor and control the sensory input coming onto my roads, because if I don't, a traffic jam forms. And the traffic has to go somewhere. And so what happens is it spills out across the brain, unfortunately. And one of the first couple of things that go are things like verbal processing, things like the safety response in the brain. An autistic behavior, as it's known, is actually just a fight or flight response. It's the brain overloading and a person trying to get out of whatever situation it's in. The biggest contributor to that in the modern age is actually sensory. It's noise. It is overload. It is just not coping with the environment. So choosing the right kind of housing is actually probably the most important thing for helping the autistic person improve. If you put them into the wrong kind of housing, the placement will fall apart extremely quickly. One example I can give of this is we had a young chap who was a young teenager who for 90% of the year was an absolute angel in school, doing well, actually a very smart kid, on target for the highest marks in all of his subjects, part of social things outside of school, really genuinely doing amazingly, apart from every Christmas something flipped, something switched, and he turned into what can only be described as a hellion. The police were called out regularly. He was maybe being put into care every year without fail at Christmas. They tried everything. They tried social stuff. They tried psychologists. They tried just about everything they could do to reduce just stresses on him and try and keep him calm. Turned out the problem was the heating pipes came on. He couldn't handle the pipe noise. It was literally driving him to distraction and fight or flight response non-stop the entire time. And what that meant is that child was never going to succeed in that house over winter. that child was never going to have a good life in that house. And if we put someone into the wrong environment, you're going to find that the entire time they will simply not succeed. They will not be able to live in that environment at all. Sorry, the noise outside somehow got even louder. I don't quite know it. Anyway.
You're doing fine, Chris.
My apologies. But yeah, an overloaded brain due to sensory stimulation causes overload behaviors, fight and flight. I won't say that every autistic behavior is down to sensory overload, but it's often an underpinning thing that builds up other behaviors. It's often something that just fills up the brain and makes everything else more difficult. And I've seen in chat that we have to remember that a lot of autistic folk have additional learning disabilities. It's true, but do remember as well that they're also the most visible autistic folk. You won't often notice the autistic folk without learning disabilities because a lot of us are doing absolutely fine and never get diagnosed. So just keep that in mind. So what is actually causing the most traffic? What do we need to look for in this housing? What do we need to actually take into account? First thing, road noise. I can guarantee you an autistic person will never do particularly well if you put them into a house on a main road. Quite simply, the traffic is inconsistent, and when it comes in, it kind of cuts into the brain. For myself, again, I think of the brain as a series of roads. So for me, it's like I have traffic suddenly just cutting into my thought process. I'm thinking about work. Oh, a car. There's suddenly a car. What was I thinking about? Oh, I need to restart. I need to rethink. And that happens non-stop the entire time, every time a car goes past. Another thing is communication, conversation in the household. If you put people into a house with multiple individuals, that might be terrific for socializing, for all of this kind of stuff. But how much noise are those people making? Again, what is interacting with this person? Is it a quiet environment, or are they having to deal with the noise of, say, staff or other people living there? And the last thing, lights. That picture there is actually how I experience fluorescent lighting. It is utterly blinding to me. I cannot, for the life of me, stay in a room with fluorescent lighting. It's simply impossible. It gives me a migraine within 20 minutes, and during that time, I'm pretty much useless. It's worth noting, this is something I probably should have said earlier, it's very hard to describe autistic overload to someone that doesn't experience it themselves, because you're literally describing the brain not functioning very well, and that presents very differently from person to person. For myself, when I'm in a sensory overload, it feels like I've lost 50 IQ points. It feels like I've genuinely dropped down to the learning disability kind of boundary. I find it very difficult to engage in conversation. I feel slow. I feel stupid. It's embarrassing. I want to remove myself from that situation. So I can't stress enough how much sensory overload impacts people. Like, even those who are not as sensitive to sensory as me will have, say, their processing capabilities reduced by 10%, 20%. There will be a marked difference between a good sensory environment and a bad in how you're interacting with the individual. So that's examples. Again, we've just talked about this on the how you see it on the left, how I see it on the right. You want to stick away from fluorescent lighting, and you want to have, I think it's high voltage LED rather than low voltage. Basically, a lot of lighting flickers a bit. Something like fluorescent actually operates on a U shape, and half of it's on, half of it's off, and it flickers back and forth to save electricity and money. And we can actually pick up on that flicker. So be very aware of what kind of lighting there is. If you can, natural lighting, wonderful. There's a reason windows have been invented. They're pretty wonderful things. They light up a room well. If you can do natural lighting, it's brilliant. You do not want rooms that you can't turn the lighting off in. I've had many a meeting I've turned up to that has somehow been inside a building with no ability to turn off lights, and I've just simply had to go, I can't be in that room. You can't have an autistic person in bad lighting. It's very painful. Be very aware of lighting changes as well, room to room. I struggle a lot to leave my room and go downstairs just for a casual drink or something like that, because I'm walking from my pitch black room, which is very comfortable for me, into a corridor that's reasonably well lit, because my parents, for some reason, need light to be able to see by. So they like having light across the house. I struggle with that. I have to almost build myself up, and I have to have a really good reason to leave my room, because otherwise I have to adapt to that. And when we're walking into a different environment, say into a darker area, it is very similar to being blind. It takes our brain a serious amount of time to process the environment. It takes a while for us to clip on to what's actually going on. So on the left, there is a staircase. On the right, something. Now, if you're trying to lead me into that, say you're you're showing me around, you're leading me somewhere, I'm not going to walk through that doorway on the right because, quite frankly, what am I walking into? This is where you get refusal. This is where you get people not going from space to space. It's because have they processed what they're walking into? What some people do, and it's what I do, is we follow people. So I'll let someone lead me somewhere. I'll go into what I call duck follow mode. I especially do this if I'm going to somewhere like London. I let someone lead me through London because it's so overwhelming. I'm basically blind. I can't process what's going on around me. And the thing is that if someone's leading the way, if they fall screaming into a pit, you can stop in time. You're safe. They will face the dangers before you, and it's a safety thing, which is why we like being led occasionally. But be very aware of lighting changes. It is brutal. I actually do sensory assessments, and I've looked at many locations where there certain trust or hospital are looking to place an autistic person into assisted living instead of being in a hospital, and they've asked us to go in and look at it. And I've had to say like no, because just the rooms have such different light levels that going from room to room was just painful. It actually hurt. I had to stop in each one. It was difficult. In the modern age, the biggest killer for autistic folk is likely noise. If you've got any sensory sensitivity towards noise, it's brutal. Like, again, I cannot ignore whatever's going on outside at the moment. It just isn't. It's interrupting my brain nonstop. Fortunately, I've done this talk so many times that I can kind of do it on automatic mode. But I'm not entirely sure what's coming out of my mouth at the moment. I'm hoping it's good, but this is all automatic because I can't ignore the noise going on. So you've got to think, is it road noise? Is it heating pipes, conversation, water, aeroplanes, trains, and other outside noise invaders? What is adding cars to the roads? That's what you've got to consider. It's very difficult to make a perfect autistic environment. You really have to adapt it a lot to the individual because we're all unique in our sensory needs, but you can make a neutral one. You can make one that doesn't add traffic. A lot of our autistic behaviors come about because we haven't had a chance to actually get rid of the traffic in our brain. We haven't had a chance to download. We haven't had a chance to clear traffic. And what you want to do is give us an environment where that's possible. It's very much like at the end of a day, having a glass of wine and sitting there with your loved ones watching TV or something like that. It's an activity. We need that activity to just clear the roads, chill out before bed, relax. And it's impossible in a house that's loud. Other things to look out for is keys jangling, again, social conversation, cars, yeah. Alarms, obvious, is a very obvious one. Ticking clocks, something people don't usually think about. A ticking clock is, again, it's adding a car every time it clicks. Is that interrupting non-stop? I've actually had to go into rooms and take down a clock during a meeting before at work, which is a very interesting thing to do when you're trying to make a good impression on people. But I simply couldn't have the clock going. Things people don't really think about is actually texture. What are you touching? Like at the moment, I assume most of you are covered in clothes. I can't see all of you, but I assume most you're covered in clothes at the moment. That's 80–90% of your body being covered in clothes. Think how much of your skin is actually touching something at this moment in time. You're sitting in a chair, you're maybe sitting at a desk. Think how many parts of your body are touching different textures. Now, what if one of those textures was genuinely unpleasant to you? It was ultra sticky, it was rough, it was cold, it was hot. It's, again, things adding a huge swath of cars to your roads. Things like handles, especially metal handles or banisters, are a nightmare because they could be hot, they could be cold, they could be clammy, they could be weirdly sticky. They could have any texture you can imagine on those things there. So we don't like reaching for them quite often. I walk in the middle of the stairs so I never have to touch a banister because you never know what texture you're going to get on them. Again, clothing. I can't wear socks easily. I dislike socks to such an extent. Like I really do. I wear bamboo socks 2 sizes above my size. They're like the silkiest, smoothest socks without seams that I could possibly find. And I still put them on only at gunpoint because I just can't handle things on my feet. And yet I wore them all the way through school. I was only diagnosed at age 21. So I'm only thinking to myself, was I putting myself through some overload the entire way through because of socks? And I didn't know about this when I was younger. Admittedly, no one did back then when I was younger. I'm 29 now, but 15 years ago, people didn't actually know about sensory and autism particularly, so it wouldn't have helped. But, you know, you look back and think what would have changed, what would have been different if I'd known about this kind of stuff. We often get things like refusal for toilet spaces and things like that for autistic folk. How large is the toilet? Is it a constricted space? What is the toilet seat like? Is it cold? Is it hot? Again, is it somewhere that's got noise in the pipes? Is there a reason people are refusing to go into these spaces? The best way you can find an autistic person likes a space is to try and put them into it and see how they like it, because each individual person's sensory needs are so different. Barring that, get another autistic person in to assess it, or someone who's skilled in. I'm not saying only autistic person can assess sensory. If there's a skilled neurotypical, obviously can, but actual sensory assessments are a must for any autistic housing you've got putting people into. Smells. Doesn't matter if it's a good smell or bad. If you've walked into the room wearing the most amazing floral perfume in the world, it might be brilliant enough it attracts people from miles around to smell it. It doesn't matter, because all that's doing is adding cars to my roads. And now consider things like cleaning products. I can't stand citrus. It's too sharp. It's all I can focus on when it's happening. And yet, what are most cleaning products? Citrus. It means things like bathrooms are a nightmare for me whenever I go out somewhere, because they either smell terrible and really do need a cleaning, or they smell of citrus and I just simply can't handle them. And I'll go in and like kind of a army style raid and sprint in there and sprint out at full speed because I can't be in that space. So be very aware of what smells you're putting people. Also, things like washing clothes, even showering. What smells are you putting on your body? Think how many different layers of smells you might have on your body at this moment in time for someone who's sensitive to smell. Now imagine an environment where you have lots of smells. I had a housing situation where someone had a really nice house. It was like a little cottage. They got really lucky in their placement. It was beautiful. Only issue is it was right next to a bakery, which sounds amazing. Fresh bread smell, all of this, wonderful. Apart from having that all day, every day was very overwhelming to the individual in that house. It's a lovely smell, but when it's non-stop, when it's just in your face the entire time, this person was very sensitive to smells. What started as a positive really turned into a negative pretty quickly. Concluding, because I know you'll probably want to have a break now. Basically, try and strive to find the best sensory environment you can. It is just key to any autistic individual. Prioritize sensory over everything but safety. I can't stress it enough. I know I've talked about it a lot today. It is the major contributor to road overload. It's the major contributor, like underpinning a lot of autistic behaviors. And listen to the individual. We're not very subtle people, us autistic folk. We don't tend to do subtle very well. If we don't like something, we won't be doing it. It's usually that simple. If we don't like a room, we won't be going into the room. If we don't like wearing certain types of clothing or certain foods, we won't be eating and wearing it. It's that simple. Like, actually listen to us. We're giving you feedback, but sometimes you need to look for it because it's hard for us to verbalize it. The last thing an autistic person in sensory overload can do is verbalize what they're going through because their brain is overloaded. It's very, very difficult for us. You sometimes have to watch the behaviors instead. And please do feel free to ask for a sensory assessment if you're not sure of a location suitability. Like the services are out there. NDTI offer them. I know other places offer them. Please do use them. It's very, very useful indeed. And I think that's it for me. Thank you very much, everyone.
Wow,
I'm sorry if I was waffling a bit.
I think that's fantastic and really, really useful talk, and well done given the lawnmower, which I couldn't hear at all, but I appreciate that you ploughed on through. So thanks, Chris. That was really good. We've got time for a few minutes. We've got a few minutes for questions. Would you be all right, Chris, if we invited people to ask a question or two?
Yeah, 100%. Sure.
Yeah. Anybody got anything directly for Chris? There's some really great feedback coming up in the chat. I suppose my thought was that I certainly in the course of the work we're doing at NDTI, we work with a lot of young people with autism, but also generally some of the things you flagged are ones just to think about across the board, in my opinion. Helen, you've got a question. You've got your hand up. Hi.
Hi. Sorry, you might not know the answer to this, but we sort of think of people as almost getting used to things. The sock thing was interesting because my son wouldn't wear socks for years and he does wear them now. Does that actually happen? Do people get used to certain things, or are we kind of kidding ourselves and putting extra pressure on somebody that needn't be there? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes and no. If you imagine that the sock portion of the brain is a tiny country road at the start, if you put enough cars for it, it slowly does develop over time, but it is gradual. It's never going to be a motorway. So it might one day grow to the point where it's not a huge negative, but it's not ever going to be a positive, basically. So yes, it can change. The brain does adapt to our environment. That's just part of brain physiology. It does slowly adapt to what's going through it, but it's never going to be a strength. It's never going to be pleasant, probably. Maybe
Right.
you found different socks or so. Like maybe it's just, yeah, maybe he's just dealing better with the environment now or the world around him.
Yeah, no, about 6 months of the year we had Ugg boots, and 6 months of the year we had Crocs for a long time, and then
Yeah.
Thank you. It's 11:15 and we're on target, so I'm going to. Oh, we have one other question. I can't see who's asking it. Would you like to turn your camera on, Roseanne? Do you want to ask Chris a question?
Yeah, sorry, I think it was Helen that came before me, but if Helen doesn't mind, thank you, Chris. That was great. One of my experiences, I'm looking at housing provision, and one of my experiences with an autistic client was they had a pet, a dog, and that came at the 11th hour. And all of a sudden, any solutions we looked at, suddenly there was a pet, which became quite a restrictive ask when you look at landlords and everything else. So I wanted to ask you your experience of pets and whether or not it's something that people do default to with sensory autistic needs. And I don't mean that patronisingly, but it is important when you're looking at housing solutions. Like you say, it's a very important consideration. I just wondered what your experiences were of that.
Yeah, good question. It's I guess it depends on how the individual views the pet. If the pet can be that safety individual that they can kind of follow, like example, my family was part of a test for autistic guide dogs, basically, and so one individual had a large Labrador that would walk in front of them, and it was incredibly useful to every autistic person that tried it. And then we also had a little terrier that walked alongside people. It wasn't a tool because one was one you could follow and kind of it was a safety thing. Another was one walked alongside and added to the sensory. So it very much depends to the individual if it's a sensory coping mechanism. Because I have a couple of friends who you take away their animal, their whole life would fall down in about 3 minutes flat. Simply, it's a coping mechanism. It's a way I guess it's a pillar of support is a term I use. It's something that they really do use to cope with the environment. So it's very much on the individual. Sometimes it's brilliant. I know other autistic folk who can't handle the input of an animal being around them at all because it's just sensory information. It's not helping, it's harming. So I'm afraid it really is individual, but based on, is it a sensory coping mechanism or not, basically.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.